14 parishes, one island, small enough to drive across in a day, and 14 completely different answers to the question of where your family actually came from. Kingston, St. Andrew, St. Thomas, Portland, St. Mary, St. Anne, Trelawny, St. James, Hanover, Westmoreland, St. Elizabeth, Manchester, Clarendon, St. Catherine. Every Jamaican family on earth comes from one of those 14. There is no 15th, which means, unlike every other video I've made, nobody watching this gets left out. And the 1817 registers say something different about every single one. Now, some of you are already thinking it. A whole parish can't have one origin. People moved, families mixed. My grandmother was born in Clarendon, and her mother came from somewhere else entirely. You're right, all of that is true. After 1838, freedom created movement. People walked off estates, founded free villages, went looking for land and work, and within 2 generations the map got complicated. But the registers aren't from after 1838. They're from before. And in the decades this paperwork covers, people did not move. They were not permitted to. An enslaved person was legally attached to an estate, in a parish, and that estate bought captives from the ports its owners had contracts with. So the parish isn't a guess about your family today. It's a record of where the paperwork was at the last moment before everything scattered. The closer you get to 1817, the tighter it holds. Here's what most people never got told. In 1816, colonial authorities in Jamaica passed a law forcing every enslaver on the island to register every person they held. Name, age, African-born, or Creole. Updated every 3 years, in writing, by law. It wasn't decency. Britain banned the trade in 1807, and slavers kept smuggling anyway. The registers were an accounting tool, a way to catch people cheating. But an accounting tool built to protect property leaves behind the same thing as a census, if the people being counted are the ones reading it 200 years later. And here's the part almost nobody knows. In 1817, Jamaica did not have 14 parishes. It had 22. St. David, St. George, Vere, St. Dorothy, St. John, St. Thomas in the Vale, Metcalfe, all of them real, all of them holding records, and all of them abolished in 1867, folded into the 14 we have now. So if your family's trail seems to vanish, it may not be that the record was lost. It may be that the parish itself stopped existing and the paperwork got absorbed into a neighbor. That's the first thing to check, and almost nobody checks it. So that's what this is. 14 parishes, counting down what each one was buying, which stretch of African coast it was buying from, and what the people written into those books did about it. Stick around for the top 3. Number 2 is the parish the British had to sign a treaty with because they could not win. And number 1 is the parish where the people in these registers ended the entire system themselves, 4 years after the last register was filed. Before we start, put your parish in the comments. Just the parish. And your family surname if you want. That comment section has turned into a map. St. Elizabeth, Savlamar, Bamboo, St. Anne, Aberdeen, Port Antonio. People in England, in Canada, in New York, finding cousins they'd never met underneath a YouTube video. Add yours. Somebody's looking for you. And subscribe, because we're going parish by parish after this. Every estate, every corridor, in detail. All right. 14. Manchester. We start with the youngest parish on the island. Manchester didn't exist until 1814. It was carved out of Clarendon, St. Elizabeth and Vere just 3 years before the registers began, which makes it the only parish on this list whose entire recorded history sits inside the era of registration. It's high country, cool, hilly, and never suited to the big sugar operations that defined the coast. What grew there was coffee and pimento on smaller properties with smaller workforces. That matters because small properties bought differently. Instead of shiploads arriving direct from Africa, Manchester estates often bought people already on the island, resold, transferred, moved inland from the coastal parishes, which means Manchester's African ancestry is mostly inherited from St. Elizabeth and Clarendon, predominantly Gold Coast, modern Ghana, arriving second-hand. The newest parish on the island, carrying the oldest corridor on the island. 13. St. Andrew's St. Andrew wraps around Kingston like a collar and climbs straight up into the Blue Mountains. Down low, it was estates and provision grounds feeding the capital. Up high, it was coffee, and coffee properties were a different world from sugar. Smaller, colder, more isolated. The registers for St. Andrew show a genuinely mixed picture. Because it sat next to the largest port in the Caribbean, it drew from every corridor feeding that port. Gold Coast, Bight of Biafra, West Central Africa, all present, none dominant. But look up. Above those coffee walks are the Blue Mountains, and in those mountains were the Windward Maroons, free, armed, and unconquered, looking down on the estates the whole time. The parish closest to colonial power was also the parish living directly underneath the people who had escaped it. 12. Kingston. Kingston is the smallest parish in Jamaica, and it is where almost everything on this list arrived. The wharves at Kingston Harbor were the single largest disembarkation point for enslaved Africans anywhere in the British Caribbean. Ships came in from the Gold Coast, from Bonny and Old Calabar, from Loango and the Kongo River, and they unloaded here. And Kingston wasn't just a destination. It was a distribution center. Captives landed here and were then sold onward to other parishes and to other colonies entirely. So Kingston's registers are unlike anywhere else on the island. Fewer field workers, more urban trades, carpenters, coopers, seamstresses, dock workers, sold and resold within the city. If your family is Kingston, your ancestors likely came through every corridor at once. The port didn't specialize. It received everything. 11. St. Catherine St. Catherine holds Spanish Town, and Spanish Town was the capital of Jamaica until 1872, which means something very practical for you. This is where the registers were physically filed. The clerks, the record offices, the colonial secretary, all in Spanish Town. The paper trail for the whole island ran through this parish. St. Catherine also absorbed 3 of the abolished parishes, St. Dorothy, St. John, and St. Thomas in the Vale. If your people are from that central plain, and the name of the parish in an old document doesn't match anything on a modern map, that's why. The estates across the St. Catherine Plain were large and sugar-driven, buying heavily through the Gold Coast in the early decades and shifting toward West Central Africa, Kongo and Mbundu people, as the 18th century wore on. The parish that held the paperwork on everyone else has one of the most layered records of all. 10. Hanover is the far northwest corner, and it is one of the most concentrated parishes on the island. Its estates bought through the Gold Coast forts more consistently than almost anywhere in the Caribbean. Ashanti and Fante country, modern Ghana, year after year, decade after decade. And that concentration had consequences the planters did not anticipate. In 1776, a conspiracy was uncovered in Hanover. A planned rising, organized across multiple estates by Coromantee, the British name for Akan people shipped through those forts. It was discovered before it began, and the response was brutal. But think about what it took to organize it. People from different properties, coordinating in secret across a parish. That's only possible if they shared a language and a command structure, which they did because the planters had spent 70 years buying from the same coast. They built their own problem, one purchase at a time. Tertrine. Portland is wet, mountainous, and hard to reach. The northeast corner, where the rain comes off the Blue Mountains and never really stops. Its estates were smaller, and it never bought in the bulk the western sugar parishes did. What Portland's registers show instead is a notably high share from the Bight of Benin, Yoruba and Fon country, modern Benin and southwestern Nigeria. That corridor left fingerprints all over Jamaican folk religion and drumming that are still there today. And Portland is nanny country. Above Port Antonio, in terrain the British could not march through, the Windward Maroons under Nanny fought the colonial army to a standstill and forced a treaty in 1739. Nanny is the only woman among Jamaica's national heroes. The parish, too rough to farm properly, turned out to be exactly rough enough to be free in. 8. St. Mary sits on the north coast, and it is where the whole thing started. Easter, 1760. On Frontier and Trinity estates, a man the records call Tacky, a Fante chief who had been taken and sold, led a rising that became the largest slave revolt in the 18th century Caribbean. It spread parish to parish and took the British over a year to fully suppress. St. Mary's registers lean toward the Bight of Biafra, the Niger Delta, Igbo territory, ports at Bonny and Old Calabar, with a strong Gold Coast presence underneath it, which is exactly where Tacky came from. St. Mary also absorbed the abolished parish of Metcalfe, another one to check if your trail goes cold. A Fante chief, sold into a parish that had been buying from his own coast for 50 years. The planters had imported the leadership along with the labor. 7. Clarendon is the Central Plain, and it operated at a scale most parishes never approached. Some of the largest single estates in Jamaica were here. Big properties meant bulk purchasing, and bulk purchasing means the shipping records are unusually clear. Clarendon families are traceable through some of the best documented purchase patterns in the whole archive. The pattern is a layered one. Gold Coast Akan captives dominating the early decades, then a rising share of West Central Africans, Kongo and Mbundu, as demand outgrew what the Gold Coast could supply. Clarendon also absorbed Veer, an abolished parish on the southern coast that shows up constantly in older documents and on no modern map at all. Two of the largest streams in the entire trade stacked one on top of the other in the flattest, most heavily farmed land in Jamaica. 6. St. Elizabeth. St. Elizabeth is the deep south, dry in places, green in others, and running right up against the edge of the cockpit country. Its estates bought overwhelmingly through the Gold Coast, and on the northern edge of this parish is Accompong. Accompong is a maroon town founded by people who escaped in the earliest decades of British rule, named for the brother of Cudjoe, who led the Leeward Maroons to a treaty in 1739 that the British had to sign because they could not win. It is still there. It still holds a degree of self-government. Every January the 6th, it still marks that treaty. So in one parish you have the estates and the free town, buying from and escaping to the same ancestry, 20 miles apart, for 150 years. 5. St. Anne is the North Coast, and no parish has produced more voice. Marcus Garvey was born in St. Anne's Bay in 1887. Bob Marley was born at 9 Mile, in the hills above, in 1945. One built the largest black organization in history, The other took the sound of this island to every country on Earth. The registers here show that layered North Coast pattern, early Gold Coast Akan captives, then a heavier later wave through the Bight of Biafra, as the sugar frontier expanded along the coast. St. Anne is also the parish name I see more than any other in the comments. Bamboo, Higgins Land, 9 Mile, Claremont. If that's you, hold on. St. Anne gets its own video, estate by estate. There's too much here for one segment. 4. Westmoreland. Westmoreland is the western tip, and it is the parish that came closest to taking the island. When Tacky's Rising spread out of St. Mary in 1760, the phase that landed in Westmoreland was larger and lasted longer than the original. Hundreds of people, organized, holding out for months in country the militia could not control. Westmoreland's registers point overwhelmingly to the Gold Coast. Same corridor as Hanover. Same corridor as Trelawny. This entire western end of Jamaica was buying from one stretch of coast, relentlessly, for generations. And that is the reason for everything that happened here. The planters were not importing individuals. They were importing a shared language, a shared military tradition, and a shared understanding of what a chief was. Then they put thousands of those people on the same parcel of land and were surprised. 3. St. Thomas. St. Thomas is the far southeast, and it is where Jamaica found out what freedom was actually worth. October 1865, Morant Bay, Paul Bogle, a deacon from Stony Gut, walked a delegation of small farmers to the courthouse over land and justice, 30 years after emancipation. The response was a massacre. Hundreds killed, Bogle hanged, and George William Gordon, a mixed-race member of the Assembly, arrested and executed on evidence that would not have convicted anyone. Both are national heroes now. St. Thomas's registers point strongly toward the Bight of Biafra, and St. Thomas absorbed the abolished parish of St. David, which appears in old records constantly. Freedom came in 1838. St. Thomas is the parish that proved it wasn't finished, and paid for saying so. 2. Trelawny. Trelawny was carved out of St. James in 1770, and it borders the cockpit country, a landscape of limestone sinkholes and blind valleys where a column of soldiers can disappear. Trelawny town was a leeward Maroon settlement. The British fought them in the First Maroon War and lost, and in 1739 signed a treaty rather than continue. Then in 1795 they did it again, the Second Maroon War. And when it ended, the British deported the Trelawny Maroons first to Nova Scotia, and then in 1800 to Sierra Leone. Sit with that. They were shipped back across the exact ocean their grandparents had been dragged over to the same coast by the same empire, as punishment for refusing to be owned. Trelawny's estates bought Coromantee, Gold Coast, Akan, in some of the highest concentrations recorded anywhere. They knew who they were dealing with. That's why they built the great houses in this parish with gun loops in the walls. 1. St. James and Number 1. St. James, on the northwest coast. Montego Bay, Sugar Country, Gold Coast Corridor. Some of the wealthiest estates on the island. Christmas, 1831. A Baptist deacon named Samuel Sharp organized what was supposed to be a peaceful general strike. The enslaved population of the parish would simply refuse to return to the fields after the holiday. It became the Baptist War. Around 60,000 people, the largest uprising in the history of the British Caribbean. It was put down with extraordinary violence, and Sharp was hanged in the square in Montego Bay in May 1832. His last recorded words, were that he would rather die on the gallows than live in slavery. 14 months later, Parliament passed the Abolition Act. The people who did that were not abstractions. They were written down by name, by age, by estate, in the registers we've been talking about for the last 15 minutes. Property, in a ledger, in a parish. And they ended it themselves. That's the thing nobody tells you about these records. Every line was written by someone who thought they were doing bookkeeping. Not one word of it was meant for us. And it's the only reason any of this is recoverable. The system that tried to make your family anonymous kept meticulous receipts. It couldn't help itself. And now the receipts are the evidence. 14 parishes. 22, if you go back far enough. 1 island, and 14 different roads back across the Atlantic. Yours is one of them. It's written down. It's still there. Put your parish in the comments. Somebody down there is from the same district as you and doesn't know it yet. And subscribe, because we go into St. Anne next. Estate by estate, name by name. Your family didn't come from Jamaica. They came from somewhere to Jamaica. And the paperwork remembers which somewhere.